Hello. Today we'll talk. Today we have a Bible lesson for sixth Sunday of Epiphany, and we will stay in Genesis 45, verses 3 to 15. But we'll start a little bit before. Prior to the lesson, we'll have couple. I need to make a couple remarks on Book of Genesis as a whole. My personal take. This is. It's hard to say that this is my favorite book, but out of the whole Bible, I spend probably most of the time in Book of Genesis. It's a book of beginnings. We have beginning of the world, we have beginning of humanity, we have beginning of sin, and therefore we have beginning of redemption. And after the flood, we have new beginning of the world and of humanity, and we have beginning of chosen people, and we have beginning of idea of empires with Egypt, and so on and so forth. In Hebrew, it's called Bereshit, which is be is like in, and Reshit is, you can translate either is in the beginning, or you can say it's in the head of. So the head kind of goes first, and that's the concept. So to in a sense, therefore, even in the title, in the Hebrew title, to understand the Bible as a whole, we need to understand Genesis. What's going on in Genesis? Recently, I had a conversation with a friend of mine where we were talking about the cross. And I said, to understand what happened at the cross, you need to understand what happened in the Garden of Eden, of course. So, in some sense, the key to whole Bible is chapters from 1 to 6, pre-flood story. That's crucial. That's important. And in this sense, I would like to share Luther's thought on Book of Genesis. In this first book, Moses teaches how all creatures were created and whence sin and death came into the world. But immediately thereafter, he teaches whence help is to come, namely, not by the law or man's own work, but by the seed of the woman, Christ promised to Adam. Genesis, therefore, is made up almost entirely of illustration of faith and unbelief, and the fruits of that faith or unbelief, what they bear. It is exceedingly evangelical book. And this brings us to this evangelical idea, but it is important also to notice that at least three out of four Gospels build up their story on, let's say, Genesis concept or Genesis construct. Matthew starts his genealogy, the genealogy of Jesus Christ or Jesus the Messiah, son of David, son of Abraham. So he brings us back to this story of Genesis, the story that started in Genesis. And the Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph that we will talk about Joseph today. So that's in Matthew. Mark, the beginning of Mark, if you want to go with me, Mark 1:1 starts with the phrase, the beginning of gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. So this idea of beginning, he builds up on the basically the beginning. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the world. So Jesus in Gospel of Mark creates new kingdom as a Son of God, as a king. But that's again creational idea. And of course, as we probably all know, Gospel of John 1:1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and so on and so forth. So that in the beginning, that's basically this wonderful idea of restarting Genesis story, but starting this time properly with good Adam, that who will not fail, who will not betray his bride, who will not betray his task, who will go through severe temptations, but overcome them, and finally be victorious. And giving the rule over the whole world, what Adam had from the very beginning. So the structure of Genesis is, the book of Genesis is made up, I will comment on the word made up. I need to comment on the word made up. So the book of Genesis is made up of introduction, and that's verses 1. So it's like intro, and we have 1, 1, 2, 2, 3, and then we have 10 consequent stories, each of them starting with the same phrase, taledot. In Hebrew, it's taledot. Has nothing to do with, I don't think it has anything to do with the city Toledo in Spain, but maybe the city was named after one of these wonderful stories. Who knows? So we have first story goes from 2:4 to begin to the end of chapter 4, so right before chapter 5. So it's getting crazier and crazier. 4:26. The second story starts 5:1 and goes into 6:8, and so on and so forth. So the 10th story, actually the longest one, it's very interesting, starts in chapter 37:2 and goes to the end of chapter 50. So it's 50:26, and that's where our story is, like inside of this story. And that's kind of important to know. So side thought, maybe someday it will be interesting to compare 10 stories of Genesis with another sequence of 10 things, as we know 10 commandments. So how first story picks up on the first commandment, and the second one on the second commandment, and so on and so forth. I said the book of Genesis is made up of 10 stories. By phrase made up, I by no means do believe that the book of Genesis was not or is composed with, now it's a very famous theory of like 4 sources, Yahwehist, Elohist, and it was either written by Moses or it was pre-Moses, and it was by the time of Moses, most likely he already had it. How do we know it? There is a hint for that in the beginning of second story. If you want to go with me to Genesis 5:1, chapter 5, verse 1, it is, okay, in English Standard Version, the phrase goes like that. This is the book of the generations of Adam, okay? So, even before the flood, there is a chance that even before the flood, they had books and they were able to read and write. And I know for some people it could sound strange and very shocking new idea, but if we read Bible very carefully, in chapter 4, after Cain killed Abel, his brother, what happens? What happens is, Cain knew his wife, chapter 4, verse 17. Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. When he, most likely Cain, built a city, he called the name of the city after the name of his son, Enoch. If you want to build a city, and a city in the ancient world is a complex of buildings surrounded by walls, so you need to have some kind of structure. I have enough imagination to see how a person leading a group of people can build it with no plan. I can imagine that, but most likely they had some kind of plan, they had some kind of idea, so they wrote it down that the streets would be this way, that would be our central place, that's how our wall will go. So all of that was written down. So I have no problem to believe that even before the flood, we have book of genealogies of Adam. So sons of Adam by his third son, Seth. Okay, now we'll go to the text itself. Actually, the text is relatively, how can I say, self-explanatory. There is not much of the thing that we need to kind of like pay a very peculiar attention to, but I will just comment as it goes. So, verse 3. Or let us start with verse 1 actually. So then Joseph could not control himself before all those who stood by him, and he cried, excuse me, and he cried, "Make everyone go out from me." So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. Okay, he is viceroy. He is prime minister of Egypt, as we now put it. He is second in command, and even Pharaoh says that only throne will be a difference. I still will be the royalty, but he rides on second chariot right after him, and people bow down to the Pharaoh, to the king, and to Joseph. So since we know what will happen after that, right after that, and he wept aloud. Okay, he did not want anybody in Egypt to see him weeping, because still it is a relatively harsh country, and the ruler should be strong. So he cannot present himself weak, and therefore he had to send everybody out, and only brothers saw him weeping. And we'll talk about this openness of Joseph a little bit closer to the end. And he wept aloud, so the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. So they hear the weeping, but they don't really, Egyptians, they do not really know what's going on over there. And then Joseph said to his brothers, actually in the story of Joseph, especially when he sees brothers after a long time, after many years, we'll talk about many years too, there are few weepings in the story. He cries out quite a lot. Probably he is a unique character in the Bible who cries so much. Theoretically, you can label him as a crybaby, but seriously, he goes through a very serious emotional crisis. He sees brothers who sold him, almost killed him, and then sold him to slavery. And even though he ended up as a prime minister, some of the years of slavery were not fun whatsoever. Slavery is never fun whatsoever. But so he goes through very serious emotional crisis, as I said. So Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" Interesting. He repeats this phrase twice. I am Joseph. Okay? So he presents himself as Joseph, but in verse 3, immediate thing that he asks is, "My father yet lives?" Okay? And that's what we translate into English as still alive. And the second time when he says it, it's the end of verse 4. He said, "I am your brother, Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt." And then his speech goes on. So, first of all, he identifies himself as Joseph, son of their father. Okay? Not really close to brother relationship. But second time when he mentions that, he already tries to develop relationship with his brothers. And that's important. Because when he asks the question, "Is my father still alive?" what the Bible tells us. But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence. Or they were like speechless. They were paralyzed, shocked. Actually, the word in Hebrew has like notes of being terrified. I mean, they seriously, they were paralyzed with fear, because here's the guy who is apart from Pharaoh, but I mean, leave Pharaoh alone. He is just a king or the king of the country, but he has no relationship to them. He is the strongest, most powerful, most authoritative person in this land. That's the guy they sold to slavery. He can do with them whatever he wants. He wants, I mean, if he would want, he could command to chop them in front of all Egypt and say, see, those guys sold me into slavery, and now I pay back. And all Egypt would applaud to that. It would be a great, great stuff. You know, nobody would say, oh, how inhumane it is. You know, it's just, he would be 100% justified by his country. They were terrified because they did not know what to expect from him. But we'll see how story will develop. So they were terrified, they were dismayed at his presence, so he addressed them second time. Come closer to me. He kind of shows that he wants to maintain close relationship with them. And I am your brother. There is an interesting story that not related to Bible in some sense. When John Paul II, Pope, Roman Pope, head of Catholic Church, wanted to meet with head rabbins in Vatican. He invited them. So that was his first phrase, I am Joseph, your brother, when he invited rabbinical representatives to his court. So I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold in Egypt. And then verses from 5 to 7, or actually 8, beginning of 8, 3 times there is like one concept repeated 3 times. And the idea is it is God who sent me. Let's see. And now do not be dismayed and angry with yourself because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land for 2 years, and there are yet 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on the earth and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. Okay, so it's like, you know, in the Bible we have it very often. If God says it once, or if somebody says it once, we need to pay attention to that. If somebody repeats it twice, we really need to pay attention. And if it's third time, it's like, it is crucially important. That's the whole, it's like the central idea of this passage is, it is not human hands in some sense who create history. People are involved in making history, but the creator, as in Genesis, as in the Bible, and is in the real world, the real creator of history is God. Regardless of our dumb mistreatments of each other, he creates a history in the way he wants. And it took Joseph some years to figure that out. It is important to pay attention to the dates in Genesis and in story of Joseph particularly. We have a, he says, it is 2nd year of famine and 5 more to go. How old is Joseph? We know how old is Joseph. We know exactly how old is Joseph. We don't need to guess. Joseph is 39 years old. How do we know it? We know it from a simple mathematical fact. Let me erase it and let me lay it out. Okay, so how math goes. we'll go back. So in 45, 6. Yes? Yes. So 45, 6, we have second year of famine. Okay? That means famine started 2 years ago. Okay? So that means, hold on. And before that, we had 7 years of plenty. Okay? So altogether, this is 9 years. 9 years when Joseph became prime minister. So how old was Joseph when he became a prime minister? We know it. If we'll go to 41, chapter 41, verse 46. When Joseph goes off to prison, interprets dreams of Pharaoh, we know that story. 41, 46, he is 30 years old. Okay? So now he is 39 years old. And it is important. Why it is important? Because, as I said, the story began in 37:2. What do we have in 37:2? In 37:2, we have a statement. These are generations of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was pasturing the flock with his brothers, and so on and so forth. Okay? So in 37:2, he is 17 years old. Therefore, from here to here, we have 22 years. 22 is actually very important in the Bible. The reason is, we don't really know it, neither in Russian, neither in English, neither in any other language. We don't really pay attention to that. But in Hebrew alphabet, there are 22 letters. So, symbolically, he goes through the years of letters, so a complete alphabet and complete wisdom number for him to realize what's going on. Because this is not the first time when he sees his brothers. He first saw his brothers roughly a year ago. They came first, then he sold them some grain, then they brought it back, then they brought back Benjamin. So sometimes goes on. Why he did not disclose himself a year ago? He needed a final year to realize that it is not you, it is God who sent me here to preserve life. For you, for your sons, for your flocks, and so on and so forth. That's really important. Then there is another important phrase. The block from 9 to 13 starts with the phrase, "Hurry and go up to my father and say to him, thus says your son Joseph, God has made me Lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, do not tarry." And the passage ends up, so you will live in Goshen, you and your children and your flocks, and everything will be great and fun. And so he encourages his brother in verse 13, "You must tell my father of all of my honor in Egypt and all that you have seen. Hurry and bring my father down here." Okay, two things. One of them is this idea of going up and down. In biblical texts, okay, this is the land of Egypt. This is the land of Israel, Galilean Sea, Dead Sea, Jordan, and that's where the, can we see it? Okay, so this is Nile, roughly, so this is Egypt. Okay, Egypt, this is not Israel yet, but that's, so biblical story is when you go to Israel, wherever you go from, it doesn't matter. You always go up, okay? You go up to the land. It's actually, the word is the same word as to ascend, okay? In Psalms 120 to 134, we have Psalms of Ascension. So that's the same root, okay? So you go up, you ascend into the land. If you go from the land somewhere, you go down, okay? You go down. Wherever you go, north, south, southwest, it doesn't matter. So you go, pay attention, in verse 9. Hurry and go up to my father, because father is still right there. So you go up to my father, and if you bring father to me, because he's right now in Egypt, you go down. Okay, so this is verse 9, and this is verse 13. So go down to me. That's kind of interesting to notice that. And then there is another interesting thing, is a concept of, again, fatherhood in the whole spiel, okay, in the whole story. He starts with father. I am Joseph. Is my father still alive? So this relationship with father are so important to him that's what he deals with. And then he goes to verse 8b, opens up another sense of being a father. God made me a father to Pharaoh. And almost all the commentators say, yes, that the phrase can be used in the sense that he was a great advisor. He was like a vizier, to Pharaoh. Yeah. Politically, yes. But the usage of the word. He doesn't say he was an advisor. He doesn't say that I became a prime minister. He says, God made me a father to Pharaoh. And we see this realization in chapter 47, when Joseph invites his father Jacob to Pharaoh's court. Look at that. 47. Verse 7. Then Joseph brought in Jacob his father and stood him before Pharaoh. And what happens then? Jacob blessed Pharaoh. So most likely he didn't say, oh, hi, blessings to you. Most likely Pharaoh got up from his throne, came down, kneeled, and Jacob blessed him. And it's repeated second time. A few verses later, verse 10, and Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from the presence of Pharaoh. So this idea of fatherhood over even Pharaoh, over the whole Egypt is very important. And then his father can live with him. We're going back to the story of Joseph and his father. So father can live with him. And there is another interesting phrase that we need to pay attention to in verse 12. Now you see with your eyes, and the eyes of my brother Benjamin can see, that it is my mouth that speaks to you. I know in English it doesn't really make great, it doesn't really great phraseology, but that's what it is. And with this in mind, we need to kind of notice the importance of speech. We can see, of course, but you don't really see speech. You hear speech, okay? But you can see that it is me that speaking to you. I'm not only present in your presence, but I am speaking. I'm addressing you. I'm addressing brothers, and I'm talking to you that you will deliver my speech to Father, and so on and so forth. And this importance of speech is actually embedded in the concept of Trinity. In the beginning of our class, I mentioned the connection between Genesis and Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word. Okay, the second person of Trinity is actually the Word. That's the one who gives us ability to relate to each other on speech level. Okay, so, but not only. Then, verse 14, then he fell upon his brother Benjamin's neck and wept, and Benjamin wept upon his neck, and he kissed all the brothers and wept upon them. So it's not only speech, it's also touch. He, how can I say, he let himself to be vulnerable because he again cries in their presence. He weeps in their presence. He shows that yes, it is serious and very emotional, his relationship with his brothers. So, and the verse 15 actually gives us very interesting comment. He first falls upon the neck of his brother Benjamin, his full brother Benjamin. We know that Jacob had 2 wives, yes, and also those wives had their own assistants. So we have 4 women who gave birth to 12 sons of Jacob, okay, sons of Israel. So the only full brother, not a half brother, because they had the same father, Jacob, but the full brother was only Benjamin. You know, they both shared not only father, but mother, you know, Rachel. So first, he reunites, in a sense, with his brother, but then he doesn't leave all the other brothers stay aside. Verse 15, he kissed all his brothers and wept upon them. It is interesting that the great commentators of the Bible, like Kimhi, he says that showed that he accepted them. He accepted all the brothers as he accepted and loved Benjamin. Interesting concept. And only after that, see the second part of verse 15, after this, his brothers talked to him. So that it's kind of like a family reunion story now. So he had his speech, and his speech was actually it was a response to Judah's speech. So they kind of exchanged speeches, and now they were able to talk to each other. And we can say, yeah, it's almost happy ending. You know, they have lived happily ever after. They settled in the land of Goshen and got fruitful and multiplied, and that's what brings us to the next book of the Bible, Exodus. So they got so much fruitful, they got so fruitful and multiplied that some years down the road, the Pharaoh was afraid of them and decided to get rid of them. So it's kind of like a pre-Exodus setup in a sense. But even in the book of Genesis, we have this kind of crack in this beautiful painting and almost iconic family reunion. So there is like this everybody lives happily ever after, and then there is a crack. Okay, the crack is, if we go to the very end of chapter of very end of book of Genesis in chapter 50, when they buried their father Jacob, when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, it may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for all the evil that we did to him. So they sent a message to Joseph saying, your father gave this command before he died. Say to Joseph, please forgive the transgressions of your brothers and their sin, because they did evil to you. And now please forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father. Joseph wept when they spoke to him. his brothers also came and fell down before him, and he said, do not fear, for I'm not in the place of God, for you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, so have no fear, I will provide for you and your little ones. Okay? He wept in chapter 50 most likely because he realized that they did not believe in forgiveness that he offered them here in chapter 45. So when we read biblical stories, it is that's why I love it. It's the stories filled with real people, real lives, real emotions, forgiveness, real inability of accept that forgiveness sometimes, which is definitely sad, but that still makes it real. So when we read the other parts of the gospel, other parts of the Bible, filled with gospel stories of God's forgiveness, God's love, it's also real. It's real to our hearts, and our real comfort is built upon it. So stay in the Word. God bless you.